Imagine waking up one day, stumbling out of your wooden shack, rubbing your eyes, and realizing that the sun has ghosted humanity. Not just behind a few clouds, not just a gloomy Monday, but full-on, apocalyptic, the light has left this world-level darkness. Welcome to the year 536 AD, the year the sun pulled a vanishing act that would make Houdini jealous. Let's be clear, this wasn't a solar eclipse. Eclipses last minutes. This lasted 18 months. 18, that's long enough to grow a beard, lose hope, start a new religion, and still be waiting for a sunrise that doesn't feel like a cinematic horror filter. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why the year 536 was literally the worst time to be alive, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Contemporary accounts describe the horror vividly. Procopius, a Byzantine historian who normally spent his time writing polite, tactful shade about Emperor Justinian, suddenly shifted gears and wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year." Translation: imagine trying to live your life lit only by Instagram's gloomy nostalgia filter. But instead of aesthetic vibes, it was just fear, famine, and frostbite. And it wasn't just Byzantium seeing this cosmic no-show. Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman writing from Italy, said the sun appeared bluish and gave no warmth. In China, the Book of Wei noted that in the 10th month of 536, there was frost in summer and snow in August. Frost in August. Even Game of Thrones wasn't that dramatic. Let's rewind to what probably caused this, a volcanic eruption so massive it choked the skies with ash and sulfuric aerosols. Though the volcano's precise identity is still debated, scientists suspect a massive eruption occurred somewhere in the northern hemisphere, possibly Iceland. Think of it as the planet's way of saying, I'm going to reboot everything, starting with the sun. Here's how it works in non-boring science terms. A volcano explodes and spews ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, not the lower atmosphere. This is the VIP lounge of the sky. Once it's up there, it forms a veil of reflective particles that blocks sunlight, disrupts weather systems, and sends temperatures plummeting. It's called a dust veil, but that makes it sound like a dainty accessory. This was more like the Earth putting on a funeral shroud. Modern science caught up with the misery centuries later. In the 1990s and 2000s, scientists began analyzing ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, basically the planet's frozen diaries. Inside, they found thick layers of sulfur particles dated exactly to 536 AD, confirming that something massive and volcanic blew its top around then. Add to that the rings of ancient trees, which didn't grow properly in 536 because they were too cold and sad, and you've got biological evidence too. Tree rings from Ireland, Scandinavia, Siberia, and North America all show stunted growth that year. In short, science high-fived the monks of 536 and said, yeah, turns out you weren't being dramatic. The descriptions are haunting. People said it was like twilight, all day. Shadows disappeared, no sunrises, no sunsets, just a dull, murky gloom. It wasn't pitch black, but imagine a 24/7 overcast sky where the sun was replaced by a dying light bulb. Daily life? A disaster. Sundials? Useless. Farming? Good luck figuring out seasons when it feels like mid-November forever. Even the birds probably looked confused. And before you ask, no, there were no sunglasses, no LED bulbs, no warm cups of tea with inspirational quotes on them. Just darkness, cold, and an overwhelming sense that something was deeply wrong with the universe. Humans are naturally gifted at two things: overreacting and inventing creative explanations for things we don't understand. So when the sun went AWOL, people did what they do best: freak out. Some believed it was the end of the world, others thought it was divine punishment. There were apocalyptic prophecies, mass prayers, sacrifices, and one can assume a record-breaking number of people finally deciding to go to church just in case. In many regions, darkness was equated with demonic forces. No light? That must mean the devil is winning, or maybe God's angry, or maybe the emperor angered the gods by taxing bread again. Whatever the reason, people were suddenly very interested in not being sinners. The earth didn't explain itself. There were no meteorologists giving cheerful volcano warnings, no ash alerts on your phone, just a long, drawn-out, apocalyptic silent treatment from the sky. And so began a spiral, a chain reaction that we'll unpack in the chapters to come, starting with freak weather, crop failures, and full-blown chaos. But all of that began with one terrifying realization. The sun had stopped smiling, and the world forgot how to glow. When the sun decided to check out in 536, it wasn't just a lighting issue, it was a heating problem too, and not the kind your landlord forgets to fix in January. We're talking about a full planetary thermostat malfunction. Across continents, people looked up to a sky that seemed stuck on dim and stepped into a world that felt stuck in a fridge. This was the year summer packed its bags, slammed the door, and left civilization wrapped in a thin blanket of despair and disappointment. Historical records from across Eurasia all paint the same chilling picture, literally. While the sky dimmed ominously, temperatures on the ground dropped like hopes during tax season. According to modern paleoclimatologists, the average summer temperature in the northern hemisphere plummeted by up to 2.520, which might not sound like much until you realize that's the kind of dip that can ruin entire agricultural cycles. And this wasn't a fluke weather pattern, this was a climate gut punch. Over in China, where the Tang dynasty's scribes had a flair for dramatic understatement, they wrote of snow falling in August and crops dying in the fields before anyone had a chance to pretend they liked vegetables. The same was true in Mesopotamia, in Europe, and even in parts of Mesoamerica. In the Alps, ice sheets expanded, glaciers advanced, and goats probably started questioning their life choices. The cold arrived silently, with the smug patience of someone who knows they're not leaving anytime soon. And once it set in, it didn't behave like a seasonal visitor. It lingered. It settled in like mildew. One minute you're waiting for spring to bloom, the next you're digging up your neighbor's root cellar because you heard he's still got onions. The cold became part of the scenery, a constant like hunger or regret. What made it worse was how weird it all felt. This wasn't your usual winter. This wasn't even a really bad winter. This was a seasonally confused, emotionally unavailable kind of cold. Imagine stepping outside in July, expecting warmth, only to be greeted by a biting wind and the kind of grey that makes your soul nap. Across the Mediterranean, where olives and grapes normally soaked up the sun, harvests failed. The Romans, used to lounging around in tunics and sandals, suddenly found themselves freezing in stone villas, wondering if the gods had blocked the sun out of spite. And this wasn't just about comfort. The cold ripped through the very foundation of human survival, agriculture. Ancient farming relied on predictable seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer meant growing, autumn meant harvest. But in 536, the seasons gave up, crops failed, not because farmers were lazy or inept, but because photosynthesis doesn't happen when the sun has taken a personal leave of absence. Without warmth, seeds refused to sprout. Without consistent rain, many simply rotted, and when something did manage to grow, surprise frosts killed it off like an overzealous weed warden. But it wasn't just plants feeling the freeze. Animals too began dying off in large numbers, either from the lack of food or because entire ecosystems were falling apart like a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Livestock perished, fish supplies dwindled, and anyone hoping for a protein-rich winter probably settled for eating moss or boiled bark. Not because they wanted to, but because that's what desperation looks like. What's more unnerving is how global this cold snap was. In places as far-flung as Ireland, Scandinavia, the Middle East, and Japan, there are consistent records of an unusual chill gripping the land. This wasn't a localized catastrophe. This was a global cold shoulder, as if the entire planet had gotten into a silent argument with the sun and decided it was done with warmth for a while. And you know it's serious when the entire Earth feels emotionally unavailable. There was no such thing as heating unless you counted huddling with others and sharing collective dread. Firewood, once used for cooking and cheer, now became the most prized possession after food, and often instead of food. People weren't gathering around fires for warmth. They were competing to sit closest to them and negotiating family hierarchy based on who got the least frostbite. As the temperatures dropped, people's tempers rose. Cold has a way of sharpening miseries. Fingers numb, noses dripping, tempers flaring. It's hard to be optimistic when your diet consists of snow and your toes feel like they've signed off permanently. The world didn't just get colder. It got meaner, grimmer, and more desperate. Cold makes everything harder. Farming, moving, surviving, even just existing without crying icicles. But the most haunting thing about the cold of 53-6 is that it wasn't an event. It was an atmosphere, a lingering, suffocating sense that something had shifted in the fabric of reality, and nobody could stitch it back. The skies refused to brighten, the breeze refused to warm, and the people, caught between fear and frostbite, could only wait. And waiting was exactly what they had to do because the cold wasn't done. In fact, it was just the beginning of something much worse, because when the crops failed and the warmth vanished, the next thing to come knocking wasn't spring. It was hunger. In the spring of 536, farmers walked out to their fields with the same optimism that has fueled agriculture since the dawn of civilization. Seeds in hand, sun at their backs, or at least that was the plan. What they got instead was a season so broken, so unrecognizable, it might as well have been the Earth's passive-aggressive breakup letter to humanity. The ground was frozen, the sun was a no-show, and by the time harvest season arrived, the only thing sprouting was collective despair. Let's be blunt, crops didn't just fail in 536. They spectacularly, catastrophically, apocalyptically failed. Across Europe, the Middle East, and vast parts of Asia, entire harvests withered before they began. Wheat fields became barren dirt lots, barley turned to brittle straw, fruit trees shed blossoms like nervous teenagers at a dance, and all the careful planning, irrigation, praying, and back-breaking labor that had sustained civilizations for millennia, absolutely useless. It wasn't just bad weather. This was a systemic collapse of the natural order. The sky was dark, the temperatures were bizarre, rain came when it wasn't needed, and didn't come when it was. Floods followed droughts, frost crept in during spring like a nosy neighbor, and even when a few heroic vegetables managed to push their way through the soil, they were often stunted, malformed, or so lacking in nutrients that they were about as filling as boiled cardboard. Chroniclers from the time spared no dramatic flair. In Ireland, the annals of Ulster record a failure of bread in 536 and 539. Historians speak for everyone is hungry and gone. In Italy, Cassiodorus wrote about unnatural shadows over the fields and a dread lethargy that hung over both the crops and the people. Meanwhile, in China, imperial scribes reported frost in midsummer and noted that the emperor's granaries were emptying fast. Panic became policy. But if you really want to feel the desperation, let's talk about the menu. Because when the usual ingredients failed to show up, people turned to alternatives. Very alternative. Tree bark, boiled grass, roots normally reserved for animals, and on a particularly grim note, moss. Moss, that green fuzzy stuff you step over on a hike, was now being seasoned with whatever could be scrounged up and passed off as a meal. Imagine a dinner table where the main course is whatever hasn't been poisoned by despair. No sauces, no spices, just the raw, fibrous taste of we might not make it through the month. In some places there are even rumors of cannibalism. Now that's a subject medieval chroniclers approached the way your aunt approaches family scandals, whispered, speculative, but definitely implied. One Byzantine record mentions people in Armenia turning on each other when food supplies ran out. In other words, when your neighbor starts looking like a pork roast in your hallucinations, the famine has reached critical levels. And this wasn't confined to villagers or peasants. The elites, those lounging in marble villas or ruling from palaces, weren't immune. Sure, they probably got the last of the grain stores and the choicest scraps, but when the supply chain collapsed, everyone felt it. Empires don't run on gold or tactics, they run on food. And when food vanished, so did order. Markets turned into mobs. Farmers were blamed for failing to deliver the impossible. Bakers were accused of hoarding. Prices skyrocketed until flour cost more than a goat, and a single egg was worth a week's wages. In cities, food riots broke out. Not the theatrical, sign-waving kind of protest, but the punch a merchant and loot their cart kind. In many places, violence became the only reliable currency. Meanwhile, governments scrambled to look like they were doing something. Grain reserves were opened, too little too late. Edicts were passed controlling prices, not that anyone obeyed. Religious leaders urged people to repent, fast and pray, which is ironic, considering fasting had become the accidental national sport. And if you think all this horror would pass quickly, think again. The agricultural collapse of 536 didn't fix itself in a few months. Famine persisted well into 537 and beyond, because famine isn't just about one bad harvest, it's about a domino effect. No crops this year means no seeds for next year. No food means weak laborers. Weak laborers mean bad planting, and the cycle continues, dragging everyone into a pit of hunger and hopelessness that's incredibly hard to climb out of, especially when the world refuses to cooperate. Culturally, this breakdown was catastrophic. Entire rituals and festivals built around planting and harvest cycles were disrupted. Traditions that had held communities together now rang hollow. You can't dance around a maypole if your stomach sounds like a bear in a blender. In many regions, famine blurred into spiritual crisis. Gods were blamed, kings were questioned. The very rhythm of life, a rhythm measured by seeds and seasons, was thrown into chaos. The worst part? No one knew why it was happening. There was no meteorologist standing in front of a map explaining the volcanic aerosols in the upper stratosphere. There was only silence, cold, failure, and the gnawing realization that even the most basic element of survival, growing food, was suddenly no longer reliable. So yes, the people of 536 planted fields, but what they reaped wasn't wheat or barley or beans. They reaped silence, emptiness, and the creeping certainty that the worst was far from over. If you thought a single bad harvest was enough to ruin your year, try a global multi-year menu-free apocalypse where food didn't just run out, it gave up, packed its things, and took civilization's sanity with it. Welcome to the Great Famine of the 530s, the part of history where breakfast didn't energize you, it just reminded you of what you didn't have. This wasn't your average localized famine, where one unlucky region suffers while the neighbors send lentils and pity. This was food scarcity gone international, a full-throttle collapse of trade, agriculture, and any hopes you had of eating something other than regret. From Ireland to Mesopotamia, the whole known world got front-row seats to the worst dietary cleanse in human history. In Ireland, records like the Annals of Innisfallen and Annals of Ulster describe a failure of bread so widespread it turned into a multi-year event. And in medieval Ireland, bread wasn't just food, it was spiritual, tactful, and practical sustenance. If you couldn't get bread, you weren't just starving, you were probably rethinking your entire relationship with the gods. Over in Scandinavia, things went just as bleak, only with more snow and fewer vowels. Archaeological evidence suggests a massive population decline in this period. Settlements were abandoned, entire regions depopulated, and not in the casual let's move to the city kind of way. More like there's nothing left to eat but our hopes and each other. In Mesopotamia, the heartland of ancient civilization, things went from thriving trade hub to ghost town in record time. Crops failed, caravans stopped coming. The great urban centers that once managed irrigation, grain stores, and commerce became echoes of themselves. Merchants didn't just lose customers, they lost roads, security, and any reason to carry goods if there were no mouths to feed. The reason this became a global catastrophe was because everything was interconnected, even back then. Ancient trade routes like the Silk Road, which snaked across Asia, didn't just carry luxury goods. They carried food, animals, seeds, and the basic materials needed to survive. But once regions began hoarding their dwindling supplies, the system broke down faster than your cousin's Wi-Fi. Caravans that used to roll through deserts with sacks of grain now sat still. Ports that buzzed with barter became eerily quiet, and cities that thrived on imported food faced a new reality. No one is coming to save dinner. But the worst wasn't just the hunger. It was the social unraveling. In times of famine, hunger doesn't just eat food. It eats trust, compassion, and stability. Entire communities fractured under the weight of scarcity. People turned on each other, accused neighbors of hoarding, or worse, of stealing food in the night. There were accounts from the Byzantine Empire of mobs storming bakeries, looting grain silos, and even kidnapping farmers to try and extract information about secret caches. It was like a medieval episode of Survivor, except nobody was winning and everyone was hallucinating about bread. And then, of course, came the whispers, the rumors, the unspoken taboo that somehow always makes an appearance in the darkest chapters of human history: cannibalism. Now, let's be clear. We're not talking about verified public meat buffets, but in the records of this time across multiple cultures, we begin to see eerie phrases, desperate measures, the unspeakable acts. Families driven beyond reason. These weren't just poetic turns of phrase. These were polite, panic-coded ways of saying, some people may have eaten some other people. When your pantry's empty, your neighbors are gone, and winter hasn't blinked in 3 months, things get grim in a hurry. Meanwhile, governments did what governments always do during apocalyptic disasters: too little, too late, and with a royal decree that probably made things worse. In Persia, tax collectors were still knocking on doors long after those doors had fallen off. In Byzantium, the emperor ordered grain reserves released, but the carts never reached the provinces. And in some regions, leaders tried to regulate food prices, which is adorable when there's no food to price. Religious figures took center stage, urging populations to pray, fast, and offer penance. But when people are already starving, fasting loses its spiritual appeal. Monks in Asia blamed cosmic imbalances, priests in Europe claimed divine punishment, and shamans in remote regions insisted the sky had been cursed. In a way, everyone agreed. The world wasn't just broken, it had been cursed by hunger itself. There were also those who tried to profit: hoarders, black market traders, lords who locked up food in stone granaries while peasants dropped in the fields. It was a time when the concept of sharing became laughably outdated, replaced by sharp elbows and sharper pitchforks. And through it all, humanity kept shrinking, not just physically from hunger, but spiritually from exhaustion. The famine wasn't just in the stomach, it seeped into the mind. People forgot what full felt like. Children grew up not knowing the taste of fruit. Entire villages passed months without seeing a single market day. And the psychological toll of that deprivation is something no chronicle can fully capture. In the end, this wasn't just a famine, it was the world's bleakest buffet, offering only misery in oversized portions. And just when people thought it couldn't get any worse, they were about to find out the universe still had one more surprise course coming. Because what happens when people are weak, hungry, and vulnerable? In any decent empire, the two things you don't want to run out of are food and patience. Unfortunately, by the mid-530s, most structures were fresh out of both. You see, when crops fail, and the sun acts like it's on a sabbatical, people don't exactly feel motivated to pay taxes or participate in empire building. They tend to do other things instead, like riot, plot coups, and ask dangerous philosophical questions like, why are we listening to this guy in a crown again? The aftermath of the mysterious sunless years was not just local. It was a meltdown on a buffet-sized scale. Entire empires started cracking under the pressure of climate-induced misery, and what followed was a masterclass in how quickly things can fall apart when leadership meets desperation. Let's start with the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, a state that had already seen its fair share of invasions, theological arguments, and weird hats. In 536, The Emperor Justinian was trying to stitch together what was left of Rome's former glory. He'd just begun a bold campaign to reconquer parts of the Western Empire, and it was going okay-ish, but then came the ash-covered skies, the dead crops, and the economic nosedive. Suddenly, his grand ambitions were a little harder to justify when half the population was freezing and the other half was starving. You know it's bad when your tax collectors start handing out prayers instead of bills. Even worse, Justinian's own capital, Constantinople, was hit by mass starvation. Grain imports from Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, began failing. The Nile's flooding cycle, disrupted by climate shifts, meant fewer boats full of wheat and more empty bellies. The people of Constantinople weren't exactly known for their patience to begin with. See Nika riots, 532 CE, and with famine on the menu, the authorities' stability was about as solid as a soggy biscuit. Meanwhile in Persia, the Sassanid Empire was dealing with its own existential meltdown. They were technically rivals with the Byzantines, but when everything's going to hell, nobody's really winning. The agricultural devastation caused widespread hunger, especially in Mesopotamia. Authority in the Sassanid world began to fray. Local governors hoarded what little food they had. Regional warlords started acting like mini-kings, and unity became a quaint idea they used to talk about in better times, like bathhouses and fresh bread. The Germanic kingdoms of Europe, those post-Roman puzzle pieces that were still trying to figure out the whole ruling a kingdom thing, also buckled under the weight of constant crisis. These were societies where authority was often based on charisma and the ability to keep your warriors fed, but when you're handing out promises instead of pork, loyalty dries up fast. Many kings found themselves abandoned by their own people, ousted by rivals, or simply assassinated in dramatic Game of Thrones but colder fashion. This wasn't just a top-down disaster. The chaos seeped into every level of society. In regions like Ireland and Scandinavia, where oral histories and sagas were the way to remember things and occasionally exaggerate them, we see accounts of local chieftains losing power as communities turned inward, abandoning broader tribal alliances. When survival becomes your full-time job, diplomacy kind of falls off the to-do list. And while it might sound like this period was just all famine and frostbite, let's not forget about the economy, because even the ancient world ran on coin. As trade routes collapsed, who wants to buy or sell anything when there's nothing to eat? Empires found their treasuries drying up. Without the economic flow of goods, taxation became nearly impossible. And when empires can't tax, they can't pay armies. And when you can't pay armies, well, those guys with swords and a bad mood tend to find new employment, usually with your enemies. So you had emperors who couldn't fund their wars, kings who couldn't feed their courts, and peasants who were one crust away from a revolt. Governments began to decentralize not by design but by necessity. In place of strong central rule came a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions ruled by whoever had the food, weapons, or charisma to hold things together for another winter. It was a survivalist's dream, or nightmare depending on which side of the breadline you were on. All this instability sowed the seeds for future conflict and fragmentation. Some historians argue that this period marked the real beginning of Europe's transition from classical antiquity into the Middle Ages. The shift wasn't gradual, it was cold, chaotic, and cloaked in volcanic dust. In short, the skies darkened, the fields froze, and the kings fumbled. Empires didn't fall with dramatic flair, but with a slow, shivering unraveling. No dramatic speeches, no noble last stands, just a lot of really cold, really hungry people saying, you know what, maybe we try anarchy for a bit. Imagine a volcano somewhere remote, shrouded in snow, steam and mystery, belching so much ash and sulfur into the sky that it gave Earth a medieval makeover. Not a fun one either. We're talking apocalypse on hard mode. Scientists today are still playing a globe-sized game of Clue to figure out which mountain lost its temper around the year 536. Was it Iceland? Central America? Somewhere along the Pacific Ring of Fire? One thing's for sure. Something big went boom, and the planet has been side-eyeing volcanoes ever since. Let's rewind to the 6th century, when people didn't know what a volcano was. They just knew the sun stopped showing up properly. To them, the sky dimming for months or years felt like divine punishment, a cosmic malfunction, or perhaps the sun quitting its job without 2 weeks' notice. The Byzantine historian Procopius noted in horror that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. Not exactly a cheery forecast, but modern scientists equipped with ice cores and satellite-era hindsight think they've found the culprit. A volcanic eruption so massive it injected tens of millions of tons of sulfur into the stratosphere, forming a reflective veil that blanketed the Earth. That's right, one volcano may have just yeeted enough ash into the sky to dim the sun globally. This was no ordinary eruption. This was an I'm taking the whole planet down with me kind of eruption. And while we don't have a definitive address for the offender, clues are scattered across the globe. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, frozen time capsules for Earth's worst days show a sudden spike in sulfate deposits around 536. That means something very big exploded, and it wasn't anyone's social life. Tree rings from Europe and Asia offer more sobering evidence. They stopped growing. Trees, the stoic introverts of the plant world, basically shut down. No new growth, no summer cheer, just wooden silence. This kind of biological ghosting only happens when the growing season is utterly wrecked. And guess what? That's exactly what an enormous ash cloud would do. Block sunlight, lower temperatures, disrupt photosynthesis, and trigger climate chaos. Scientists call it a volcanic winter. The people living through it just called it Thursday, and then Friday, and then every day for the next 18 months that felt like the same miserable grey loop. But back to the volcano itself. Where was it? For a long time, scholars pointed fingers at Iceland, particularly the volcano called Katla, which has a reputation for being, let's say, emotionally unstable. There's geological evidence of a massive eruption there around the right time. But then eyes turned towards Central America, especially Ilopango in modern-day El Salvador, which had a cataclysmic eruption in the 6th century that left a caldera the size of a small city. Some even speculate that multiple eruptions may have tag-teamed Earth, a double whammy of doom. We don't need a smoking gun when we've got layers of ash in lake beds across the northern hemisphere, sulfur traces high in the ice sheets, and an 18-month period where the planet looked like it had been dipped in soot. Combined with the drop in global temperatures, failed harvests and upheaval, this was the moment where nature flexed and humanity just crumbled a little. Even today, scientists are still piecing together what happened, combining satellite analysis, geochemical data, and ancient written records in what might be the most dramatic episode of CSI Volcano Edition. The eruption of 536 has been linked to the start of the late antique Little Ice Age, a centuries-long period of cooling that reshaped empires, populations, and even religions. One volcanic tantrum might have shifted the entire trajectory of history just by blocking out the sun and dropping the thermometer. And yes, in case you're wondering, this could happen again. Volcanologists keep tabs on the world's most explosive peaks. But nature has a tendency to surprise us when we least expect it, which is comforting. The most fascinating part? No one at the time understood what had caused their suffering. They saw the effects, the cold, the dark, the dying crops, but they had no idea a volcano halfway across the world had pulled the trigger. No tweets, no seismic alerts, no weather app push notifications, just the sense that something big had gone wrong and wouldn't be right for a long time. The good news? Modern science can now track, monitor, and model volcanic activity with a level of precision that 6th century peasants would have considered sorcery. The bad news? We still can't stop a mega eruption. So if a volcano decides it wants to go full drama queen again, all we can do is pack a coat, stock some canned goods, and prepare to learn what volcanic winter means the hard way. Just when humanity thought things couldn't get any worse, after years of climate upheaval, crop failures, and the general vibe of an apocalypse-themed festival without any snacks, something else showed up at the party. It didn't knock. It didn't wait for an invitation. It simply arrived, in the year 501 CE, dripping with infectious enthusiasm and covered in fleas. Enter The Justinian Plague, the Mediterranean's least favorite surprise guest since the invention of naval warfare. Historians believe the plague originated in Egypt, although some argue for Central Asia. But wherever it began, it was as if Mother Nature had decided that famine and frostbite weren't dramatic enough on their own. The pathogen behind this parade of misery was none other than Yersinia pestis, the same bacterial agent that would later rebrand itself in the 14th century as the Black Death, with a slicker logo and more European touring stops. But back in 541, Yersinia pestis didn't need fancy marketing. The world was already teetering. Populations had been weakened by years of starvation and exposure. Infrastructure was crumbling, and sanitation was, in the most generous terms, non-existent. Sewage flowed freely, rats were living their best lives, and ships unknowingly carried the disease along with their dwindling cargo of grain and sad, salty sailors. When a few unfortunate fleas made landfall in the Byzantine port of Pelusium, the countdown began. From there, the disease marched through Alexandria like it was checking off a bucket list of port cities. Within a year, it hit Constantinople, the imperial capital, and when it did, it didn't hold back. Procopius, the somewhat grumpy court historian of the time, described bodies piled in the streets, mass graves dug at frantic pace, and citizens dying so quickly there wasn't even time to figure out who they were. At its peak, the plague is said to have killed as many as 10,000 people per day in the city alone. Procopius, ever the optimist, described it as a great pestilence that spared neither rich nor poor, peasant nor priest, just everyone you'd prefer not to bury that week. Now imagine you're Emperor Justinian I, trying to revive the Roman Empire while your empire is falling apart like a wet cake. You've already spent a fortune on wars, the economy is in tatters, and suddenly half your workforce is dead or dying. Then you catch the plague yourself, which Justinian did, but somehow survive, only to emerge into a city that smells like a compost bin made entirely of despair. He did rebuild parts of the city afterward, but it's hard to run a tax system or build aqueducts when your bureaucrats are either too sick to work or permanently unavailable. The plague, like all things inconvenient, didn't just vanish after one dramatic act. It came in waves, again and again over the next 200 years, like a toxic ex who just won't stop dropping by, just to check in. Every few decades a new outbreak would appear, thinning populations, derailing progress, and reinforcing the idea that this was not in fact a golden age, unless you define gold by how many teeth were left behind in the mass graves. Outside the empire, the plague didn't spare other parts of the world either. From Syria to Persia, from the coasts of North Africa to parts of Europe, the disease spread through trade routes and military campaigns. The weakened social structures caused by the prior global cooling only amplified the damage. People were already malnourished, communities were strained, and superstition, not science, guided most reactions. Some blamed divine wrath, others blamed foreigners, and a few just blamed the local baker for no clear reason. It's worth noting how eerily modern the whole scenario feels. Disease hitting vulnerable populations, misinformation spreading faster than medical aid, and governments struggling to respond while pretending everything is fine. The difference is, in 541 CE, you couldn't doom-scroll your way through it, but you could sit in a candlelit room wondering whether the itching on your leg meant you were about to meet your maker. By the time the initial wave of the Justinian plague was done, the world had changed. Estimates suggest it killed between 25 and 50 million people, which, in a world of about 200 million, is jaw-dropping. Economies collapsed, cities emptied, and the idea of a reborn Roman Empire fizzled faster than a soggy torch in a downpour. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a social reset button pressed with the full weight of biological vengeance. In the shadow of the volcanic winters and failed harvests, it felt less like bad luck and more like the universe had filed a formal complaint against humanity and was now enforcing it with extreme prejudice. By the time the 530s were wrapping up and the 540s rolled in like a particularly depressing fog, people across Europe, the Middle East and Asia had gone through more than just bad weather and empty plates. They were experiencing a full-blown existential crisis. If the clouds didn't part, the crops didn't grow, and the sickness didn't stop, then maybe, just maybe, this wasn't weather or famine. Maybe this was it, the end. The full apocalypse special, now with extra doom. After years of ash-filled skies, failed harvests, mass starvation, and a plague that wiped out half the neighborhood, you can't blame medieval folks for feeling a bit off. Optimism wasn't just in short supply, it had been exiled. The few monks left scribbling in cold monasteries weren't writing uplifting tales about the resilience of the human spirit. They were writing things like "the sun gave no light, and the land gave no food. Men ate not, and feared greatly." Chronicon Paschalo? Not exactly Hallmark card material. For the ordinary person, be they peasant, priest, or Persian merchant, daily life was beginning to feel like a divine punishment. Or worse, a curse with no known expiration date. There's only so long people can convince themselves next year will be better, when the last 10 years have felt like living in a bad dream written by a vengeful god. In the absence of scientific explanation, no one was checking volcanic sulfur isotopes or ice cores in 540. People turned to what they knew, divine wrath. Surely someone had angered God, or all the gods, or maybe it was the work of demons. Theories varied, but none were comforting. A monk in Gaul wrote, "We are scourged because of our sins. The people cry for mercy, yet the skies remain black and the fields lie barren." Some even believed that the devil had been let loose on earth. After all, famine, plague, death, and darkness, that's 4 horsemen right there. Apocalyptic thinking wasn't just for the uneducated masses. Bishops, kings, and scholars all started pondering whether the Book of Revelation had finally made it to production, and if God was angry, who was to blame? Suspicion fell everywhere. Heretics, Jews, foreigners, your neighbor who didn't go to church last Sunday, and of course, witches. Always witches. When society breaks down, scapegoats become fashionable. Psychologically, the toll was immense. People lost not just family members, but their sense of stability, order, and trust in the natural world. Everything they thought they could count on, seasons, crops, health, sunshine, had turned traitor. The world felt unpredictable, unstable, and unfair. Imagine a peasant who had scraped together a life through hard work, prayer, and obedience, only to watch his family starve, his fields rot, and his church fill with coughing corpses. How do you go on believing in justice, divine or otherwise, after that? Mental illness wasn't diagnosed or named in the modern sense, but chronic despair, apathy, and spiritual crisis filled the writings of the time. Even monks, who were basically trained to find hope in the darkest corners of creation, were writing about the overwhelming weight of suffering. Clergy across regions tried to respond. Some encouraged fasting and penance, because obviously the solution to starvation is more starvation. Others preached that Judgment Day was nigh, urging people to confess every sin just in case. Processions of barefoot penitents wandered towns, weeping, flagellating themselves and begging for divine forgiveness. Fear wasn't just in the air, it was structured into the weekly schedule. Religious art began to reflect this shift. Out went the serene saints, and in came fire, brimstone, and vividly illustrated demons. Churches painted terrifying scenes of hell not just as spiritual warnings, but as mirrors to what life already felt like. Even kings and emperors, those who had survived revolts, invasions, and tax shortages, found themselves presiding over broken systems. What do you do when no one's farming, no one's trading, and no one wants your silver coins because there's nothing to buy? Bureaucrats, normally obsessed with land ledgers and tax rolls, started scribbling prayers in the margins instead. Imperial orders during this time often veered into the religious decrees for prayer days, almsgiving, and communal penance. The state, once mighty and confident, was now just another voice shouting into the storm. The climate disaster of the 530s, 540s didn't just block the sun, it blocked the psyche. It choked optimism, darkened faith, and corroded collective sanity. For many, this wasn't just a catastrophe, It was a sign that the world had become fundamentally wrong, and yet, somehow, people kept going. They farmed a little, prayed a lot, and gossiped about the next potential apocalypse. The sun would eventually return, but for a long, shivering decade, the human spirit nearly froze along with the fields. For centuries, the year 536 AD was dismissed as just another dark spot in the blurry fog of early medieval history, a time of muddled dates, overly dramatic monks, and the sky is falling levels of gloom. After all, how seriously could you take claims that the sun had dimmed for over a year, crops had failed everywhere, and people thought demons had eaten the sun? Sounded a bit like the Middle Ages being the Middle Ages again. But then science showed up with a clipboard, a microscope, and a deeply alarming ice core sample. And suddenly, those scribbling monks weren't just complaining about their gruel being cold. They were eyewitnesses to one of the most catastrophic climate events in human history. Modern scientists have spent the past few decades doing the unthinkable, proving that ancient apocalyptic-sounding complaints were in fact pretty reasonable, using tree rings, ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, sulfur deposit data, and the occasional shocked look at volcanic ash traces found where they shouldn't be. Researchers have now confirmed what medieval chroniclers tried to write through their frost-bitten fingers. The year 536 really was a climatic train wreck. Let's start with the trees. Trees are nature's historians. They don't talk, but they sure remember. Each year, a tree lays down a new ring of growth. When the climate's great, that ring is thick. When the world's on fire, or in this case, under a sulfuric sun-blocking veil of misery, the ring shrinks dramatically. Around 536 AD, trees all over the northern hemisphere laid down the kind of thin, sad rings that scream, "I barely survived this one." A sudden global cooling event was unmistakably stamped into their woody timelines, and that evidence stretches. Dendrochronologists, the folks who study tree rings. Yes, it's a real job, and yes, they're probably the least surprised that trees outlived most kingdoms, saw a pattern, a sharp drop in growth and temperature right around the fateful year. But the real smoking gun, or more accurately, smoking crater, came from ice. Deep within glaciers, layers of snow build up year after year, locking in secrets like time capsules. Scientists drilled down into these frozen archives and found sulfur-rich layers dated to around 536. These layers aren't from a fireplace or a particularly intense Viking barbecue. They're volcanic fallout, the sky-choking remnants of a massive eruption that hurled millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere, dimming the sun and turning the atmosphere into a kind of planetary Instagram filter called Apocalypse Gray. Interestingly, those ice core records didn't just point to one volcanic eruption, they revealed a horrifying encore. Another eruption, possibly from the same volcanic system or a second volcano entirely, hit again in 540 AD. This meant the global cooling wasn't just a one-time horror show, it stretched into nearly a decade of chaos. The Earth essentially endured a volcanic double whammy. Climate historians now refer to the 530s and 540s as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a title that sounds quaint but was anything but. So where did this catastrophic eruption occur? That's still debated. Iceland is a strong suspect, known for being geologically unstable and theatrically explosive. Other scientists have suggested volcanoes in Central America, Indonesia, or even Alaska. What they all agree on is this: wherever it was, it had the planetary reach of a Marvel supervillain. One eruption, one unlucky location, and suddenly rice in China, wheat in Europe, and barley in the Middle East all failed like synchronized swimmers performing a global disaster routine. The scientific community didn't stop with just tree rings and ice. Volcanologists weighed in with chemical fingerprinting of tephra, volcanic ash, and climatologists ran computer simulations of how much sun blocking would follow an eruption of that size. The results confirmed what ancient sources hinted at. The temperature dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius globally. That might not sound like much, but for comparison, the last ice age was only about 5 degrees cooler than today. In the 530s, people weren't just cold, They were frozen in the shadow of a geophysical tantrum. Most fascinating is the collaboration that has emerged between scientists and historians. Medieval studies and climate science are now surprisingly chummy. Suddenly, a monk's grumbling about a sun without rays isn't laughed off, it's analyzed. A Byzantine historian noting strange mists and famines. That's not folklore, that's data. What once sounded like apocalyptic storytelling is now valuable testimony, and each scribbled complaint might hold a clue to unraveling the climate mysteries of the past. And while it might be comforting to think that such a convergence of disasters couldn't happen today, scientists aren't so sure. In fact, they're actively using this event as a case study for how modern societies, now hyperconnected and dependent on complex supply chains, might fare in a similar multi-year global cooling. Spoiler alert, it's not great. So yes, 536 wasn't just medieval people being overdramatic. It was the real deal, complete with atmospheric haze, widespread starvation, collapse, and a bonus plague on the side. And thanks to the marvels of modern science, we now know the monks were right all along, which honestly might be the most shocking revelation of all. So what do you get when you blend volcanic eruptions, climate collapse, crop failures, famine, plague, and spiritual dread into one terrible historical cocktail? A year that makes your worst Monday look like a spa day. But now that we've laughed nervously and grimaced through the ash, fleas, and meltdowns of 536 CE, it's time to ask the real question. What did humanity learn from all of this? The short answer, a little. The long answer, not nearly enough. Let's start with the most obvious takeaway. Nature doesn't care about your empire or your economy. The world in 536 didn't have the benefit of global satellite imaging or seismographs. They didn't even know what a volcano was unless it was actively throwing rocks at their faces. When the sun dimmed, crops failed, and people started dying en masse, there was no hotline to the Icelandic meteorological office. There was just fear, and a whole lot of guesswork involving demons, omens, and divine punishment. Fast forward to today, and we do have the technology. We can track volcanic activity, model global climate impacts, and even map historic eruptions through sulfur layers in polar ice. But here's the kicker, we're still remarkably vulnerable. One big volcanic eruption in the wrong place, say, something like the 1815 Mount Tambora event that caused the year without a summer, and we're suddenly revisiting history with better Wi-Fi, but just as much panic buying. And yes, we've got modern medicine, vaccines, and entire public health systems, but when a certain virus arrived in 2019 and decided to take a world tour, we saw how fragile the global supply chain really is. Panic, denial, toilet paper hoarding, not exactly our proudest hour, which brings us back to 536, a time when people had no clue what was happening, yet somehow they still tried to make sense of it. That's another lesson, the very human impulse to explain the unexplainable. In the 6th century, people looked to the heavens for answers. Today, we look to climate models, peer-reviewed studies, and sometimes, unfortunately, TikTok influencers. But the urge is the same. We want to know why things are falling apart. And preferably, we want someone to blame who isn't us. The people of 536 didn't have the luxury of Netflix documentaries explaining the role of stratospheric sulfur particles in global cooling. They had monks scribbling down that the sun looked funny and that crops failed again. Yet even in that gloom there were glimmers of resilience. Communities adapted, new systems emerged, and humanity, albeit bruised and battered, trudged forward. Now we face similar existential threats, though dressed in modern clothing. Climate change is no longer an abstract fear. It's very much real, and it's already playing havoc with weather systems, food security, and ecosystems. But unlike the folks of 536, we know what's happening. We know what's causing it, and we know what we need to do. The real tragedy would be ignoring all that and learning absolutely nothing from history's most cursed year. But let's not leave on a downer. There's something oddly comforting about realizing that humans have always panicked in the face of disaster, flailed around for answers, and still somehow managed to carry on. Maybe it's not about solving every problem before it arrives. Maybe it's about resilience, cooperation, and remembering that yes, things can get worse, but they can also get better, especially when we learn from the ashes. So here's to 536, the worst year in recorded history, and our unexpected teacher from the shadows of time. Let's just hope the next volcano holds off until we've at least finished breakfast. When Oscar O'Flaherty Wills Wilde came into the world on October 16, 1854, it wasn't so much a birth as it was a theatrical entrance. Born in Dublin, Ireland, he emerged into a family that was half intellectual powerhouse, half operatic performance troupe, and entirely unfit for anything resembling normalcy. Let's begin with Wilde's mother, the formidable Jane Wilde, known by her pen name Speranza. Now, Speranza wasn't just her go-to pseudonym for writing fiery nationalist poetry in support of Irish independence. It was also her general life attitude. She had a flair for the dramatic, regularly delivering passionate monologues in the family drawing room, whether anyone asked her to or not. She wore flowing dresses, quoted herself in conversations, and claimed descent from Italian aristocrats. In short, she was the original one-woman revolution in a corset. And Oscar, he absorbed it all. He learned early that words could sting, seduce, or sparkle depending on your vocabulary, and whether you delivered them while reclining dramatically on a fainting couch. His childhood home was less Victorian household and more live-in literary salon with bonus political tension. Guests included writers, revolutionaries, academics, and probably at least one guy who tried to sell everyone experimental soap. Oscar, lounging in the corner with a book nearly bigger than his head, soaked up stories and philosophies like other kids soaked up mud. Now, his father, Sir William Wilde, was no slouch either. A celebrated eye and ear surgeon, he was knighted for his work and had a habit of collecting obscure facts like they were rare coins. He also had a secret second family, yes, that kind of secret family, and rumors about his romantic escapades floated around like Victorian incense. Heavy, murky, and sure to offend someone eventually. Oscar didn't inherit the medical ambitions, but he certainly picked up his father's curiosity for the human condition, minus the scalpels and mistresses. Wilde's early education was typical for an Irish intellectual in training: Greek, Latin, and a heaping spoonful of please memorize every tragedy ever written. He did well at Portora Royal School in Enniskillen, which sounds fancy because it was. There, Wilde developed two important talents: his gift for classical languages and his ability to get away with not trying very hard. Why run when you can quote Plato about the futility of effort? But the real transformation began when he enrolled at Trinity College, Dublin, where Wilde outread and outdazzled nearly everyone. He won scholarships, wrote prize essays, and walked through academic life like it was a red carpet. But Trinity was just the warm-up act. The headliner, Oxford University. Wilde entered Magdalen College, Oxford, and promptly turned the place into his personal runway. While other students were dressing in tweed and brooding over their Latin homework, Oscar appeared in velvet smoking jackets, floral waistcoats, and the kind of collars that could double as sails. He wasn't just studying classics, he was becoming one. At Oxford, he fully embraced aestheticism, the movement that preached art for art's sake. Translation: beauty didn't need a moral. A painting didn't need to teach you a lesson. A vase didn't need to cure tuberculosis. If it was lovely, it was enough. And if Wilde was anything, he was a walking, talking argument for loveliness. He famously decorated his dorm room with peacock feathers, blue china, sunflowers, and layers of fabrics that made the entire space look like it had been upholstered by a poet with a flair for overkill. Not everyone at Oxford was thrilled. Professors were suspicious of a student who seemed more interested in silks than syllabi, and some peers mocked his flamboyance. But Wilde, being Wilde, had an answer for everything, and usually a better one than you did. In one lecture, a professor suggested that Wilde's aesthetic ideals were effeminate. Wilde, without blinking, reportedly replied, "And your tie is provincial." It's unclear if that professor ever emotionally recovered. While others measured success in grades and cricket matches, Oscar Wilde measured his in clever retorts and how many eyebrows he could raise by lunchtime. By the time he graduated in 1878, he'd won the prestigious Newdigate Prize for Poetry, left Oxford with a double first in classics, and most importantly, established himself as a man not to be ignored. This was not a man born to blend in. He was born to waltz through a sea of beige, trailing purple silk and stinging wit in his wake. From the moment he could read, he was destined to become either a legend or a scandal, or preferably both. So yes, while other boys were learning to climb trees and suppress emotions, Oscar Wilde was already practicing the art of the devastating comeback, dressed like a dandy, quoting Euripides, and preparing for the next act, becoming famous just for being himself. By the early 1880s, Oscar Wilde had achieved the kind of fame most people only get after inventing electricity or punching a prime minister. But Wilde's primary invention was himself, and his chief export, aestheticism, with a feathered hat and a devastating quote attached. In London, Wilde became the unofficial mascot of the aesthetic movement, which declared that art didn't need to teach, preach, or morally uplift. It just had to look good doing absolutely nothing. Think peacock feathers, sunflowers, blue and white porcelain, and looking wistfully at furniture while sighing about beauty. Wilde was not the originator of aestheticism, but he was its most glittering spokesperson, the first man in literary history to become famous for having a decorative opinion. Publishers, naturally, weren't quite sure what to do with him. He wasn't a famous writer yet. He hadn't published a novel, a play, or anything scandalous enough to warrant a fine. But he had a personality, and in Victorian Britain, that was already pushing the limits of public decency. Enter Richard D'Oyley Carte, an impressively mustachioed impresario who managed Gilbert and Sullivan, the musical duo whose operas were a delightful mix of satire, wordplay, and men in tight trousers. When their new operetta Patience, a satire of the aesthetic movement, was set to tour America, Carte realized a peculiar problem. Americans didn't understand the joke. They didn't know what an aesthete was. So Carte did what any savvy businessman would do. He shipped Oscar Wilde to the United States. In 1882, Wilde, then just 27, landed in New York with a trunk full of velvet, a head full of witticisms, and enough confidence to single-handedly convert cowboys into curtain critics. Upon arriving at customs, he allegedly declared, "I have nothing to declare but my genius." Now, whether or not he actually said that is debatable. What's not debatable is that everyone believed he did, because frankly it sounded like something Wilde would say between bites of imported chocolate. His official mission? A lecture tour titled The Decorative Arts and the House Beautiful. Yes, you heard that correctly. Wilde crossed the Atlantic to tell Americans to throw away their ugly drapes. He visited over 140 cities, from New York to San Francisco, Cincinnati to Deadwood. He spoke about wallpaper, tapestries, color harmony, and the moral imperative of good lighting. Audiences turned up partly out of curiosity, partly to hear what this strange Englishman with the hair of a Grecian statue and the vocabulary of a thesaurus on a sugar rush was going to say next. Wilde's aesthetic sermons baffled many. In St. Louis, a critic noted that Wilde spoke with elegance, but the subject appeared to be curtains. In Leadville, Colorado, a rough-and-tumble mining town, he gave a lecture in a saloon above a dance hall, complete with gun-toting patrons and a piano that occasionally exploded with ragtime mid-sentence. To their credit, the miners were not hostile. In fact, Wilde said later that they were among the most attentive and well-behaved of all his audiences. One man even offered him a drink from a silver cup, presumably the most beautiful object in the town. Wilde raised it and toasted, "To the harmony of form and function." The miners, unsure whether he was insulting their spittoons, simply cheered. Despite or because of the confusion, Wilde became a media sensation. Newspapers loved him. One day he was a foreign oddity. The next, he was a celebrity. They commented on his clothes, his voice, his absurd vocabulary. Some mocked him, others admired him, but all of them printed his name, and that's exactly what Wilde wanted. He wasn't just spreading aestheticism, he was performing it. Every entrance was a spectacle, every interview a monologue. He had opinions on everything from chairs to cheese to cravats. To Wilde, the world was a blank canvas badly in need of better taste. But let's be honest, not everyone was charmed. Some critics were brutal. In Boston, one paper suggested that Wilde's lecture might be improved by fewer adjectives and more diagrams. Others described him as a tulip in a field of potatoes, which, to be fair, Wilde might have considered a compliment. Still, by the time he returned to England in late 1882, Oscar Wilde was no longer a curious ornament of Oxford. He was an international figure, a man famous for turning artistic snobbery into a touring business model. He'd managed to market himself like a perfume, mysterious, stylish, and probably not for everyone. His American tour proved that Wilde didn't need a book to be a writer or a stage to be a performer. He only needed an audience, a subject, and preferably a velvet smoking jacket. And so Wilde returned to London with a few extra pounds in his wallet, a few thousand quotes trailing behind him, and the lingering scent of success, possibly bergamot and theatrical arrogance. He hadn't yet written a play, a novel, or anything that would be taught in schools, but he had done something arguably more impressive. He went to the Wild West and told them their wallpaper was ugly. Now that's aesthetic courage. By the 1890s, Oscar Wilde had completed his transformation from flamboyant socialite to full-blown literary juggernaut. Gone were the days of giving Americans unsolicited advice on interior design. Wilde was now standing squarely at the center of London's theatrical universe, sharpening his wit like a rapier and aiming it at the silk-padded hearts of Victorian high society, and society loved it. Wilde didn't just write plays, he weaponized them. Each one was a glittering ballroom of snide remarks, double entendres, secret affairs and dramatic revelations hidden behind lace gloves and teacups. He mastered the art of elegant roasting, crafting characters so richly absurd and dialogue so deliciously cruel. Audiences barely noticed they were watching their own hypocrisies get flambéed on stage. His first major theatrical hit was Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892, which premiered to packed houses and praise that made even Wilde blush. Which, to be fair, probably matched his waistcoat. On the surface, it was a high society drama about a woman suspecting her husband of infidelity. But beneath the corsets and calling cards was a razor-sharp critique of moral double standards, especially those involving women and respectability. Wilde understood Victorian society better than Victorian society understood itself, and then he tied it into a witty little bow and sold tickets. The success of Lady Windermere was followed by a string of hits, each one a gilded slap in the face of the social elite. A Woman of No Importance, 1893, a brutal evisceration of how women were judged more harshly than men for the same sins, all told with Wilde's signature elegance and sarcasm. It's essentially a polite scream in iambic pentameter. An Ideal Husband, 1895, a play about blackmail and marriage where every character is either concealing a scandal or revealing one, sometimes both before intermission. It's House of Cards meets Downton Abbey with more diamonds and fewer morals. But Wilde's magnum opus, the crown jewel of his theatrical career and possibly of the English language, was The Importance of Being Earnest. Premiering in February 1895, Ernest was Wilde's most daring, most ridiculous, and most wild play. It was about, well, technically it was about two men pretending to be named Ernest, so they could woo women who were in love with the name. But thematically, it was about the sheer stupidity of societal expectations. Everyone in the play is lying, everyone is shallow, and everyone is absolutely hilarious while doing it. The characters toss around lines like, "The truth is rarely pure and never simple. To lose one parent may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness." Every sentence in Ernest is a mini roast served on fine china. It's not just a comedy, it's a linguistic assassination with perfect hair. Critics at the time were divided. Some loved it, others thought it was too light, too silly, not deep enough. But Wilde knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't writing to make people cry, he was writing to make them laugh, squirm, and secretly wonder if he was talking about them. He once said, "I choose my friends for their good looks, my acquaintances for their good characters, and my enemies for their good intellects." That's also how he seemed to write his characters, every one of them designed to charm you, then insult you in a way so clever you didn't even realize you'd been insulted until intermission. But it wasn't just the content of the plays, it was how he presented them. Wilde didn't slink around backstage like a modest playwright. He stood in the lobby during intermissions, dressed like an opera singer attending their own opening night, soaking up the admiration and occasionally offering autographs with a faint smirk. He was a celebrity playwright before such a thing existed, and he knew it. He even made sure his name was printed on posters bigger than the title of the play itself, because if Wilde had a religion, it was branding. For a brief, glorious time, Oscar Wilde was the toast of London. Every drawing room buzzed with his quotes. Every playhouse echoed with his lines. Critics, aristocrats, and commoners alike paid to hear the sound of their society being politely dismantled one punchline at a time. But even as Wilde conquered the stage, there was a storm brewing off stage, and it wore a monocle, carried a lawsuit, and disapproved of everything that glittered. Still, in this chapter of his life, Wilde was at his peak, a playwright who turned wit into a weapon, and drawing-room gossip into enduring literature. He wasn't just writing plays, he was writing social commentary disguised as farce, with dialogue that still slaps over a century later. If Oscar Wilde's life were a Greek tragedy, which frankly it often resembled, then Lord Alfred Douglas, or Bosie as he was affectionately and sometimes resentfully known, would be the golden-haired siren who lured the hero toward the rocks with poetry, pouting, and a flair for theatrical disaster. They met in 1891. Wilde, already an established figure in London's literary and social scenes, was in his late 30s, rich in reputation, wit, and well-cut waistcoats. Bosie, a 21-year-old undergraduate at Oxford, was rich in something else entirely: youth, privilege, aristocratic cheekbones, and the uncanny ability to cause emotional explosions with minimal effort. He was the third son of the Marquess of Queensberry, yes, that Queensberry of boxing rules fame, and he carried with him the entitlement of someone who had never once been told no and believed this to be a clerical error. He had curly blonde hair, an almost angelic face, and the emotional consistency of a thunderstorm in silk gloves. He also had a poetic streak, a love of scandal, and a well-honed talent for manipulation that could have earned him a consulting gig in Machiavelli's day. For Wilde, Bosie was a walking poem, and perhaps more dangerously, a romantic project. The kind of man Wilde couldn't just adore. He had to mold, to guide, to write into something beautiful and meaningful. Unfortunately, Bosie had zero interest in being molded. He was more interested in opera, lavish dinners, and starting arguments in places where arguments should never be started, like hotels, dinner parties, or inside his own family estate. Their relationship was intense, volatile, and incredibly well documented, thanks to their letters, which could swing from adoration to accusation within the span of a paragraph. Wilde's letters to Bosie were poetic, longing, full of florid affection and literary references. He called Bosie my own darling boy, the sunshine of my life, and once, in a moment of peak Victorian swooning, described their love as a love that dare not speak its name. Bosie's letters, in contrast, often sounded like they were written with a quill dipped in perfume, rage, and mild narcissism. He could be passionately affectionate one day, and furiously accusatory the next. Wilde once wrote to a friend, "I am the only person in the world who can make Bosie happy, but sometimes I think even I can't survive him." And yet Wilde always forgave him. He paid Bosie's debts, he endured Bosie's tantrums, he followed him across Europe, he wrote him poetry, and defended his honor. In return, Bosie offered devotion intermittently, and chaos consistently. It didn't help that Bosie, for all his flaws, was incredibly charismatic. He could charm a room as easily as he could drain Wilde's bank account. He introduced Wilde to the underground world of male brothels and working-class lovers, which added a new level of danger to their already fraught relationship. Victorian England, after all, was not known for its tolerance, especially when it came to relationships that dared not speak their name. But Wilde, blinded by love, and perhaps the belief that beauty could excuse everything, including Bozzy's habit of insulting waiters and sparking family feuds, held on. Their love affair was, at its best, a meeting of minds and mouths, but at its worst, it resembled a beautifully scripted car crash in slow motion. There were fights, epic ones. Wilde would retreat, write him off, swear it was over, and then they'd reconcile in the most melodramatic ways possible. At one point, Wilde described their relationship as the love of Achilles for Patroclus, which would be romantic if it weren't also, tragic and drenched in doom. To outsiders, the relationship was a disaster waiting to happen, but Wilde was enthralled. And tragically, Bozzy was the match that would ignite Wilde's downfall, not just metaphorically, but legally and socially. Though the details of that come in the next act of this drama. At this point in the story, all you need to know is this. Oscar Wilde had fallen deeply, irreversibly and catastrophically in love with a man who could quote Latin, destroy reputations, and storm out of a dinner party in the same breath. Their relationship wasn't just doomed, it was operatically doomed. The kind of love that inspires poetry and court cases in equal measure, and the saddest part, Wilde seemed to know it. In moments of clarity he wrote about Bozzy not with blind passion but with sorrow. He once said, "He is quite like a narcotic, a drug that takes away the will and paralyzes the moral sense." But he kept taking the drug anyway. So there they were, the brilliant playwright and the beautiful storm cloud, locked in a romance so volatile it would eventually bring down empires, or at least reputations, fortunes, and the London theatre scene. But at this moment the letters still flowed, the love still burned, and Wilde, ever the romantic, still believed he could rewrite the ending. If Wilde's life had been a stage play, this is the act where the ominous music swells, and everyone in the audience starts whispering, "Don't do it, Oscar." But of course, Wilde was never one for listening, especially when pride was involved, or, in this case, pride and a disastrously unstable boyfriend with a family tree that should have been fenced off with caution tape. Enter John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry, former boxer, professional grudge holder, and the kind of man who spelled sodomite incorrectly, but managed to weaponize the word anyway. He was loud, aggressive, and completely convinced that Wilde was corrupting his golden-curled son, Lord Alfred Douglas, better known as Bozzy. To be fair, Bozzy was being corrupted, but mostly by poetry, champagne, and his own flair for dramatics. The feud had been simmering for a while. Queensberry had tried to forbid Bozzy from seeing Wilde. He even threatened to publicly denounce Oscar. But Bozzy, in true operatic form, responded by being even more devoted, because nothing says mature love like taunting your father with the person he hates most. Then came the calling card. Left at Wilde's club, it read, "To Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate that even in the process of attempting character assassination, Queensberry couldn't be bothered to use a dictionary. Now at this point, most people would have laughed it off, or at least muttered illiterate old goat and moved on. But Wilde? Wilde saw an opportunity to clear his name and get some poetic revenge. He decided to sue the Marquess for criminal libel. Everyone told him not to. His friends, his lawyers, his publisher, his butler, probably everyone. But Wilde was a man of words and wit, and he couldn't resist the idea of battling his enemy in a court of law where cleverness was currency. Unfortunately, he was about to find out that in Victorian courtrooms, cleverness only worked if you were also straight and boring. He was neither. The trial began in April 1895, and for a few seconds Wilde was winning. He dazzled the court with his eloquence, his poise, and his ability to turn any question into an elegant quip. One prosecutor asked if he'd ever kissed a certain young man. Wilde responded, "No, he was far too ugly." Bold strategy, Oscar. For a while, it seemed like Wilde might walk away victorious, but then Queensberry's legal team pulled out their real weapon, a long, damning list of Wilde's known associations with young men, some of whom were, shall we say, not listed in Debrett's peerage. Suddenly the trial shifted from being about libel to being about Wilde himself. The court was shown letters, witnesses, and enough suggestive material to make a Victorian faint into their fainting couch. Queensberry's team didn't even have to prove Wilde was a sodomite or somdomite, depending on your spelling preferences. They only had to prove he might be one, and in a society obsessed with moral posturing, innuendo was more than enough. Wilde's case collapsed. He dropped the charges. Queensberry was acquitted, but the damage was done. By suing Queensberry, Wilde had cracked open a legal and social hornet's nest. The very next day, a warrant was issued for his arrest on charges of gross indecency under the infamous Labouchere Amendment, a vague yet vicious law that essentially said, if we think you're being too gay, we'll arrest you. And so the hunter became the hunted. One moment Wilde was strutting into court in a tailored coat to deliver zingers. The next, he was scrambling to find lawyers willing to defend him and friends willing to stand by him. In hindsight, it's almost Shakespearean. Wilde's tragic flaw wasn't love or arrogance or even his inability to read the room. It was his faith in the power of wit to win the day. He believed the world was a stage, and if he delivered the best lines, he'd get the final bow. Instead, he got handcuffs. As the curtain fell on the libel trial, Wilde's once glittering world began to unravel. The salons stopped inviting him, the press sharpened their knives, and all because he went to court to defend his honor without realizing that Victorian courts didn't believe he had any left to defend. But then again, this was Oscar Wilde. If he was going to go down, he was going to do it wearing silk, quoting Plato, and flinging wordplay like daggers until the very end. If Oscar Wilde's life was a Greek tragedy wrapped in velvet and sprinkled with bonze mots, then the courtroom was his third act downfall, complete with betrayal, irony, and the kind of devastating timing only fate or the Victorian legal system could dream up. After suing the Marquess of Queensberry for libel, Wilde's flamboyant charm had one job: to dazzle the courts just as it had dazzled London salons. Unfortunately, charm isn't a legal defense, especially not when the opposing side has hired private detectives and plans to read your love letters out loud in public. Let's set the scene. The year is 1895, and Oscar is walking confidently into the Old Bailey. He is still basking in the glow of his theatrical triumphs and dressing as though he's attending a champagne brunch with the gods. His velvet lapels were immaculate, his cane polished, and his ego also polished. He believes that, like in his plays, the cleverest man in the room always wins. He was about to be reminded that real life is rarely as witty and never as forgiving. To refresh without repeating previous chapters, Wilde had sued Queensberry for accusing him of being a sodomite, which might have been more forgivable if it hadn't also been criminal. Wilde was outraged by the insult, but instead of letting it go like a reasonable person, or even a mildly cautious one, he brought it into a courtroom where reason and Oscar Wilde's private life were destined to collide. Queensberry's defense strategy was simple: prove the accusation was true. And unfortunately, truth is a full defense to libel. Within days, Wilde's former lovers and acquaintances were being tracked down and interviewed. Some were offered immunity in exchange for testimony. Others, fearing prosecution themselves, turned coat faster than a Victorian coat rack. Private letters between Oscar and Lord Alfred Douglas, better known as Bosie, were dragged out, including one particularly damning note that began, "My own boy," and ended with the prosecution raising its eyebrows so high they left orbit. When Wilde took the stand, he still believed his wit could outmatch their scrutiny, and to his credit, some of his exchanges remain legendary. When asked whether a certain young man was of good character, Wilde replied, "He is a peculiarly plain boy, unfortunately ugly. I pitied him for it." It brought laughter from the gallery. But laughter doesn't sway juries, especially juries full of proper men in top hats who wouldn't know irony if it served them tea and committed perjury. The prosecution, led by Edward Carson, wasn't here for Wilde's banter. Carson was a fellow Irishman and former schoolmate from Trinity College, which makes the entire affair feel less like a legal battle and more like an emotionally charged alumni roast. Bit by bit, Wilde's carefully crafted persona was dismantled on the stand. Carson pounced on contradictions, exposed inconsistencies, and implied improprieties. And while Wilde sparred like a fencing master, he didn't realize the crowd wasn't cheering anymore. They were sharpening their pitchforks. Eventually, Wilde dropped the libel case, and at that precise moment the momentum shifted like a chandelier falling from the ceiling. Not only did he lose, but the evidence unearthed during the trial was now public and damning enough to warrant his own arrest. He went from plaintiff to defendant in the blink of a powdered eyelash. Warrants were issued. Wilde, now technically a fugitive, had a chance to flee to France. Friends begged him to go. Trains were available. Tickets were bought. But Oscar, in either a moment of supreme courage or catastrophic pride, refused. "I will stay and face whatever comes," he reportedly said, as if playing the part of the doomed tragic hero in one of his own plays. He was arrested at the Cadogan Hotel, ironically, while enjoying a plate of sandwiches, and thus, the man who once lectured America on wallpaper and threw verbal daggers at dukes was now being charged under the criminal law, a law so vague and prudish that it practically criminalized being fabulous. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The theaters pulled his plays, publishers stopped printing his books. High society, which once toasted him with champagne and laughter, now couldn't run fast enough to disassociate. Wilde became a ghost overnight, a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors and Victorian fans. His name was scrubbed from playbills. His friends scattered. The press, which had once quoted him like scripture, now flayed him daily. He was no longer a celebrity. He was a scandal. The man who had made a career out of elegant mockery was now mocked in return, his downfall chronicled with cruel glee. The satire had turned savage, and Oscar Wilde was no longer in control of the script. The courtroom became a stage, except this time, the critics were holding handcuffs, and the audience, well, they had front row seats to the world's most fabulous implosion. By 1895, Oscar Wilde's world had gone from champagne receptions and theatre premieres to a grey-walled prison cell with a bucket in the corner and no hope of a matinee. The man who had once waltzed through high society draped in velvet and epigrams now shuffled in chains, stripped of dignity, health, and even his once sharp silhouette. Welcome to Reading Gull. Population, one very, very uncomfortable aesthete. Wilde was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour after being convicted of gross indecency under Victorian laws that found his act more offensive than, say, child labour or colonial atrocities. Victorian justice wasn't blind so much as willfully myopic, especially when it came to anything involving love between men. Wilde's sentencing wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a public spectacle, a moral crusade disguised as a trial, followed by a punishment designed to break both body and spirit, and it did. Reading Gaol was no luxury retreat. The food could have doubled as roofing material, and the work was brutal. Wilde, whose exercise regime had previously consisted of waving fans and lifting teacups, was now breaking stones and walking a treadmill. A real one, not the sort where you listen to podcasts and pat yourself on the back. His health, already fragile from stress and previous imprisonment, rapidly declined. He suffered from chronic ear infections, dysentery and exhaustion. Imagine the world's wittiest man being forbidden to speak, write, or even receive proper reading material for months at a time. For a man whose mind had always been his best weapon and defense, it was a slow and agonizing erasure. But even in this dark void, Wilde's brilliance refused to die quietly. While at Reading, he was eventually allowed to write, and what he produced was not the flamboyant satire of his plays, nor the glittering banter of his former essays. It was De Profundis, a devastatingly raw, 50,000-word letter addressed to Lord Alfred Douglas, his great and terrible love. Gone were the cheeky jabs and clever zingers. This was Wilde stripped of armour, bleeding onto the page. He poured out grief, betrayal, longing and anger, not just at Bozzy but at himself, at fate, and at a society that devoured him for being exactly who he had always been. De Profundis is part memoir, part confession, part philosophical treatise, and entirely heartbreaking. It reads like someone trying to pick up the pieces of a shattered mirror, only to realize their reflection will never look the same again. He chastises Bozzy for his selfishness, laments his own blindness to it, and tries somehow to find grace in the suffering. It's also where Wilde, in his broken state, speaks of Christ, not as a religious figure, but as a man of sorrow, misunderstood and mocked, whose tragedy mirrored his own. It's the closest Wilde ever came to spiritual vulnerability, and it's impossible to read it without feeling like you're eavesdropping on a soul mid-collapse. And still, through the devastation, Wilde found moments to be wild. He famously described prison life in letters with droll observations about the architecture. His cell door had the aesthetic of a particularly malevolent biscuit tin. And when discussing prison uniforms, he lamented the complete absence of cuffs. Only Wilde could observe systemic dehumanization and still be annoyed by the tailoring. Upon release in 1897, Wilde was a ghost of his former self. His once glorious hair had gone white. His body ached constantly. Friends had vanished like theatre patrons at the end of a dull act. His mother had died while he was imprisoned. And Bozzy was back in high society, arguing about poetry and inheritance money, as if his relationship with Wilde had been nothing more than a footnote with good hair. Oscar Wilde emerged from Reading Gaol with no money, no home, and no real plan except exile. Yet what he carried out with him was something more profound than cleverness or reputation. It was the raw truth of a man who had suffered deeply, who had loved foolishly, and who had finally seen the world for what it was, not the glittering mask he'd once adored, but the cruel machinery behind it. Even broken, Wilde was not entirely silenced. His voice, aching, regretful, wiser, lingered in De Profundis, later published posthumously and now considered one of his greatest works. It's the sound of a man who once dazzled the world with light, now speaking from its darkest corners, and in that darkness, something eternal glows. Call it resilience, call it genius, or simply call it wild. By the time Oscar Wilde emerged from prison in 1897, he was no longer the glittering toast of London society. The once dazzling Prince of Paradox had been replaced by a man who looked older than his years, physically depleted and emotionally hollowed out. His health was ruined. His reputation lay in tatters, scattered like the punchlines of his former self. England had cheered his wit. It now crossed the street to avoid him. And so, like many a disgraced soul with nowhere to go, Wilde fled. France offered no fanfare. No red carpets or literary salons awaited him. He moved quietly under a pseudonym, Sebastian Melmoth, a name pulled from Gothic fiction, and just melodramatic enough to fit the mood. It sounded less like a man hiding from shame, and more like a washed-up opera singer. Still, it gave him a little distance from the headlines that had once screamed his name. Unfortunately, what it didn't give him was money. Wilde was broke. Not no champagne at lunch broke, writing IOUs for socks broke. He wandered from town to town, sometimes alone, sometimes with the flickering company of old friends who dared to be seen with him. Bozzy reappeared briefly, like a moth to Wilde's fading flame, but the old passions had curdled into something bitter. Their reunion was not the rekindling of great love, but more like reopening a wound just to check if it still hurts. Spoiler. It did. Paris became his final refuge, though refuge might be too generous a term. He holed up in the Hotel d'Alsace, a grimy little inn where the wallpaper did battle with his sensibilities. Wilde, ever the aesthete, even in decline, quipped to a friend, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One or the other of us has to go." History claims the wallpaper won. His days were filled with memories that curdled into regrets. He lived off borrowed money and fading fame, occasionally scribbling poetry, occasionally seeing visitors who still adored him, though often from the safe distance of pity. Once he'd sold out theatres. Now he barely sold his books. His once dazzling epigrams, "I can resist everything except temptation. To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance," still lingered in the air, but their author had become a ghost, haunting cafes and park benches instead of soirees. Still, Wilde wasn't entirely gone. That sharp tongue flickered even in despair. When asked by a journalist whether his time in prison had reformed him, he replied, No one can reform a man who enjoys penance as much as I do, a Wildean paradox to the end. As his health deteriorated further, he suffered from chronic ear infections, likely worsened by untreated meningitis. His circle of visitors shrank. One of the few constants was his humor. Bitter, yes, but still sparkling like cracked crystal. "I am dying beyond my means," he told a friend, poking fun at the very idea that a man like him could afford something as final as death. On November 30, 1900, Oscar Wilde died. There were no weeping crowds, no floral tributes, no funeral trains. Just a few loyal friends, some unpaid hotel bills, and a world that had already moved on. He was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, later given a tomb that looked like a cubist angel crash-landed on its face. Visitors now come to pay tribute, often leaving lipstick kisses on the stone, a strange but fitting homage to the man who once scandalized society, simply by living as himself. It's tempting to read Wilde's life as a tragedy, a brilliant star extinguished by cruelty, hypocrisy, and the iron grip of moral panic, but Wilde himself would have insisted it was a comedy, a very dark, ironic, exquisitely worded comedy, where even the punchlines could make you cry. For all its bleakness, Wilde's exile wasn't silent. His voice echoed on through his works, his wit, and the lives of those he inspired. He may have died broken, but Wilde's legacy remains fabulously rich, and judging by the fact that people are still quoting him at cocktail parties, writing his name on theatre marquees, and yes, laughing at his jokes more than a century later, he might have lost the duel with the wallpaper, but he won the long game. When Oscar Wilde died in 1900, broke, bruised, and buried beneath layers of scandal, few could have guessed he was merely taking a very dramatic intermission. His earthly curtain had fallen, but Wilde, ever the master of timing, had something else in store, an encore that would take decades to build, centuries to fade, and a fan base so loyal it could outlast most pop stars. If Victorian England tried to bury him under shame and ruin, history would later exhume him, draped in silk, glittering in relevance, and more quoted than any influencer with a ring light. Wilde's posthumous revenge was less about vengeance and more about vindication. As the 20th century cracked open, the world began peeling back the moralistic wallpaper that had suffocated his reputation. Slowly, scholars, artists, and readers began to realize what had been lost: a mind so sharp it could cut diamonds with dialogue, a wit so potent it could disarm an empire, and a soul whose courage shone through even the deepest humiliation. Wilde didn't just make a comeback. He staged a full-blown resurrection, complete with dramatic lighting and a killer final line. The first rumblings came in literature. His works, once overshadowed by his trials, were dusted off and held up as masterpieces of satire, social commentary, and human insight. The Picture of Dorian Gray stopped being that scandalous book and started being taught in universities. His plays, particularly The Importance of Being Earnest, returned to stages with the applause they always deserved. What was once considered mere entertainment was now rebranded as razor-edged brilliance. Wilde had written like a man watching the world with one eyebrow permanently raised, and that angle aged beautifully. Suddenly, Wilde wasn't just a writer, he was a symbol. He was a reminder that brilliance and queerness and defiance were not mutually exclusive. His quotes started showing up on posters, tattoos, protest signs, and Pinterest boards. Lines like "Be yourself, everyone else is already taken" became personal mantras. "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars" was no longer a witty aside. It was a battle cry wrapped in poetry. Art followed suit. Films like Wilde, 1997, starring Stephen Fry, introduced new audiences to the man behind the myth. Documentaries, novels, plays, and even operas revisited his life with sympathy and admiration. Statues went up in Dublin and London, cast in bronze, yes, but with expressions that still seem to be judging your outfit. Wilde's face became a kind of cultural passport. Recognize it, and you were in on something. A club of thinkers, dreamers, and dramatics who knew that style and substance didn't have to fight for attention. Even the legal world, which had once dragged him to ruin, eventually offered a kind of contrition. In 2017, the UK posthumously pardoned Wilde and thousands of others convicted under the same unjust laws that had destroyed his life. The Wilde pardon was more than symbolic. It was a historical handshake, an admission that he was right all along and that society, not Oscar, had been the real tragedy. And through it all, Wilde's ghost seemed to giggle. After all, what better revenge than to be remembered not for your disgrace but for your genius, to go from a criminal to a cultural cornerstone, to lose everything and yet win immortality. Today, Wilde isn't just quoted, he's revered. He's not just studied, he's adored. He's the shimmering proof that truth, wit, and fabulousness can survive even the most brutal erasure. Because when the dust settled, Wilde was still standing. Not physically perhaps, but in legacy. In every quip that shuts down a troll. In every play that skewers hypocrisy. In every young artist who dares to be dazzling and defiant. He died in exile, but he lives in museums, syllabi, memes, and marble. He lost his freedom, but gained immortality. And immortality, darling, has much better lighting. Before we had paper to crumple, lose, spill coffee on, or doodle during Zoom calls, humanity still had things to say and not nearly enough convenient surfaces to say them on, so we improvised. And by improvised I mean we wrote things down using whatever we could find that was vaguely flat, semi-durable, and didn't scream when etched into. Let's begin with the earliest known graffiti artists, prehistoric humans. Their medium of choice? Cave walls. Nothing says urgent message like smearing berry juice across a damp limestone surface. These early humans painted animals, symbols and stick figures that may have represented anything from hunting plans to a heated argument about whose turn it was to find firewood. Some scholars suggest these images had spiritual meaning. Others think they were the world's first attempt at an art gallery, complete with a no-touching the mammoth policy. Meanwhile, in ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians decided walls were too mainstream. They took to clay because what's better than writing on mud that hardens into something you can't erase? Using a stylus, they impressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets in a script called cuneiform. These tablets recorded everything from business transactions to hymnals, proving once and for all that bureaucracy predates both capitalism and paper cuts. Picture an accountant hunched over a soggy brick, calculating how many goats someone owed in taxes. Mesopotamia, the original spreadsheet. Over in Egypt, the Nile gave birth to a civilization that was way too glamorous to write on mud. Egyptians etched their hieroglyphs into stone slabs and obelisks, essentially turning public writing into giant, immovable billboards. Temples were decorated with inscriptions about the gods, pharaohs, and occasionally passive-aggressive messages about conquering neighbors. For more private affairs like love letters or grocery lists, probably just more grain, they used leather scrolls or linen soaked in resin. Durable, portable, and if you squinted, vaguely papery. But no culture quite mastered the art of early writing surfaces like ancient China. Long before they gave the world fireworks and noodles, the Chinese were grilling turtle shells for spiritual advice. This wasn't an avant-garde barbecue, it was divination. Known as oracle bones, these fragments, usually ox scapulae or tortoise shells, were inscribed with burning questions like, "Will the harvest be good?" or "Is war with the neighbors advisable?" Then they were heated until they cracked. Priests interpreted the cracks, and the answers were recorded directly on the bones. So yes, early Chinese writing was literally hard to digest. Greeks and Romans, ever the innovators, didn't exactly invent new surfaces, but did refine existing ones. They used wax tablets, small wooden frames filled with wax that could be inscribed and then smoothed over for reuse. A sort of reusable whiteboard for the toga-wearing crowd. This gave rise to some of the earliest note-passing in schools, and maybe even passive-aggressive to-do lists from Roman wives. "Dear Gaius, stop leaving your sandals in the atrium. Love, Julia." Then there were palm leaves, bark, and even metal sheets depending on what was around and how wealthy or desperate the writer was. Palm leaf manuscripts were especially prominent in South and Southeast Asia. Neatly stitched together, they formed books, long before Europe figured out that bound pages were in fact a good idea. Just imagine trying to take lecture notes on a brittle leaf the size of a remote control, and you'll appreciate your spiral notebook a lot more. Of course, none of this early ingenuity made writing easy. If you wanted to leave a message, you needed a hammer and chisel, or a flaming stick and a cowbone. These materials were heavy, fragile, or flammable, sometimes all three. You couldn't casually scribble ideas, every word was a commitment. There was no backspace key, only regret and maybe a replacement tortoise. What's astonishing is how much humanity accomplished before paper. Empires rose and fell, religions spread, and poetry bloomed, all using methods that could double as workout routines. Writing wasn't just communication, it was labor, and yet from muddy Sumerian receipts to scorched questions etched on ox bones, people wrote anyway. The human urge to document, declare, and doodle transcended inconvenience. Eventually someone would think, there has to be a thinner, lighter, more foldable way to remember what I bought at the market, and paper would arrive like a miracle wrapped in pulp. But for thousands of years we made do with stones, skins, shells, and whatever else didn't scream when carved into. The good news? We got our point across. The bad news? If you misplaced your clay tablet, that divorce decree was going to take another 3 weeks to dry. Before the days of post-it notes and spiral-bound journals, there was papyrus, a writing surface so prestigious that it practically came with its own chariot and entourage. While today we might jot down grocery lists on napkins or type angry tweets at 2 a.m., the ancient Egyptians had an altogether fancier solution, a plant-based invention that was both delicate and demanding. Enter papyrus, the OG of scroll culture, and the world's first mass-market stationery item that also happened to be a nightmare in humid weather. Papyrus wasn't just a plant, it was practically an empire in stalk form. Growing in dense clusters along the Nile's edge like gossip at a royal banquet, Cyprus papyrus was tall, reedy, and utterly unassuming, until someone figured out how to beat it into submission and turn it into writing gold. The process, as with most ancient genius, was half craftsmanship, half brute force. First, the stalk was sliced into thin strips, peeled and soaked in water. The inner pith was the star of the show, chosen for its fibrous flexibility and soft feel, though probably no one was describing it in spa terms at the time. Once softened into something vaguely mushy and pitiful, the strips were laid out in perpendicular layers like a low-carb lasagna, pressed together and left to dry under slabs of weight, because a Nile rock paper press clearly predated modern office supplies. The plant's natural sap worked as glue, bonding the sheets together without so much as a dab of Elmer's. After drying in the sun and being polished with shells or stones, the result was a smooth golden-hued sheet that looked chic and expensive, mainly because it was papyrus was so central to Egyptian life that entire bureaucracies ran on it. Tax forms, government decrees, religious texts, love poems, passive-aggressive notes from scribes, everything was immortalized on scrolls that could stretch for meters. Owning papyrus wasn't just practical, it was political. The government had a tight grip on its production and export, almost like they'd invented DRM before it was cool. If a neighboring civilization wanted some sweet Nile-crafted papyrus, they had to go through official Egyptian channels. It was a monopoly in swamp form. And yet, for all its prestige and utility, papyrus aged about as well as unrefrigerated yogurt. While dry Egyptian air preserved many ancient scrolls in pristine condition, thank you arid climate, once papyrus ventured beyond the sun-kissed Nile and into places with actual moisture, it wilted like a diva caught in a drizzle. Humidity turned it into something between damp spaghetti and forgotten laundry. That's why, while the ancient Egyptians saw papyrus as eternal, the rest of the world discovered it was more limited edition. Still, for several centuries papyrus ruled the Mediterranean communication game. It became the preferred medium in Greek and Roman bureaucracies, and was even used by early Christians to transcribe sacred texts, proof that a plant from a marshy river delta had found its way into the very heart of theology, politics, and late-night Egyptian poetry that probably read suspiciously like modern-day breakup texts. Ironically, despite papyrus's fragile ego in wet conditions, its cultural weight was immense. Scrolls filled libraries, scribes became rock stars, albeit with scoliosis, and a well-crafted papyrus document was a status symbol, a sign that you were literate, connected, and possibly in debt to the priesthood. But like all drama queens, papyrus couldn't stand competition. Eventually it was outclassed by more durable materials like parchment and later paper itself. Yet it had left its mark, literally and figuratively. Without papyrus, half the ancient world's knowledge might have been lost to temple walls and faded oral storytelling. The plant that once lined riverbanks became the reason empires wrote, recorded, and remembered. In the end, papyrus was less about being permanent and more about being pivotal. It was flaky, fragile, and fickle, yes, but it gave ancient civilizations a way to store memory, pass down knowledge, and complain in writing. And honestly, what more could we ask from a humble plant with high aspirations? If you ever looked at a medieval manuscript and thought, wow, that looks fancy, congratulations, you've just admired what is essentially glorified cowhide. Before paper strutted onto Europe's intellectual stage in bulk, people were writing their deepest thoughts, laws, prayers, and shopping lists, probably on animal skin, and not just any skin. The smoother, younger, mooier, the better. Welcome to the era of parchment and vellum, where literature wasn't just livestock metaphorically, it was livestock, literally. Let's start with the basics. Parchment is made from the skin of animals like sheep and goats. Vellum, the VIP of the scroll world, is made from calfskin, young calfskin, which is both incredibly specific and slightly ominous. The process to create it wasn't exactly light work. First, the skin had to be soaked in lime to loosen hair and fat, then it was stretched on a frame and scraped meticulously with a crescent-shaped knife. Not gently, not lovingly, scraped like a pot that had been scorched with medieval stew. Afterward it was dried, sanded, and occasionally whitened with chalk. The final product was a creamy, durable sheet, ideal for surviving centuries in a cold abbey and just fragile enough to make every scribe's hand tremble with anxiety. Now, if you're wondering who had time to skin a goat, scrape it bald, and then turn it into a medieval PowerPoint, monks had the time, lots of it, cloistered away in scriptoria, the ancient equivalent of cubicles, only colder and with way more Latin. These devout men spent their days bent over desks copying manuscripts one letter at a time. No buttons, no printing press, no double click to select all, just quills, ink, and the slowly yellowing memory of the cow that gave its life for psalms. And yes, it could take months to finish one book. Illuminated manuscripts, those glittering gold-drenched pages with swooping vines and tiny unicorns playing lutes, took even longer. If there was ever a time when the phrase "don't mess it up" held actual mortal weight, this was it. One blot of ink in the wrong place and someone might have had to start over, or at the very least, cry into their wool robe for 3 days straight. Because of the painstaking labor and the high-end leather component, books were rare and ludicrously expensive. Some were so valuable they were chained to lecterns in libraries to prevent theft. Others were passed down through generations like magical heirlooms, or in some cases, used to demonstrate the wealth of kings, churches, and particularly pretentious nobles who wanted you to know they could read, or at least afford people who could. And let's not overlook the unintended consequences of using cows as Amazon delivery boxes. For every manuscript made, a small barnyard choir sang its final moo. Large Bibles might consume dozens of skins. That meant parchment production could literally exhaust a region's livestock supply. And when the cows ran low, so did the books. A shortage of parchment meant a shortage of knowledge, history, and legal documentation. In other words, your village might have laws but no physical record of them. Good luck in court. By the high Middle Ages, the parchment industry had become so huge that towns had entire guilds dedicated to it. These weren't glamorous jobs. It was smelly, greasy, and involved a lot of drying hides in the sun, meaning a city producing lots of manuscripts also smelled suspiciously like a poorly managed petting zoo. Of course, the parchment party didn't last forever. Eventually, the rise of paper, cheap, plentiful, tree-based paper, began to chip away at vellum's grip on European literature. But even as paper infiltrated libraries, vellum remained the go-to choice for the most important texts. Treaties, royal decrees, and documents the king didn't want eaten by mildew or rats. In fact, some governments were still using vellum for official documents as late as the 20th century, because apparently nothing says we mean business like sending a memo written on Bessie's back. So let's sum up. Parchment was high maintenance, expensive, labor-intensive, and smelled faintly of barn, but it preserved ancient thought through plagues, invasions, and the occasional candle fire. Without it, we wouldn't have some of the oldest copies of the Bible, Aristotle's works, or your favorite medieval bestiary describing how to defeat a basilisk using only eye contact and sass. Funny, isn't it? We think of books as delicate now, but there was a time when your reading material was tough, durable, and once mooed at the sunrise. Let's be honest, if you were going to rank the most quietly powerful inventions in human history somewhere between the wheel and indoor plumbing, paper would be sitting there smugly unwrinkled. It's thin, it's light, it tears in the rain, but it once carried entire empires on its back. And for that we have to thank one very crafty man in ancient China, who probably didn't realize he was about to change the world using rags, bark, and discarded fishing gear. Welcome to the tale of actual paper, not papyrus, not calfskin, not chiseled rocks or shell-etched love notes to your ancestors. No, this is the story of how a Han Dynasty eunuch named Kai Lun essentially invented the world's first TikTok scroll, a writing surface that was portable, practical, and much less stabby than a bamboo slip. The year is roughly 105 CE. The Roman Empire is busy building aqueducts, gladiators are fighting lions, and in the east the Han Dynasty is flourishing with bureaucracy so thick it could file its own taxes. Problem: managing an empire meant a lot of writing. And while the Chinese had long used bamboo strips and silk for documentation, neither was exactly convenient. Bamboo was heavy and about as flexible as a stubborn mule, while silk was expensive and frankly too fashionable to scribble on. Enter Kai Lun, court official, innovation enthusiast, and the guy who looked at garbage and thought, this could be something. His genius, combining mulberry bark, old rags, hemp waste, and used fishing nets into a pulp, then spreading it into thin sheets, draining the water, pressing it flat, and drying it. Voila, paper. Lightweight, flexible, cheaper than silk, and less bruising than bamboo. Honestly, it was like inventing Wi-Fi for bureaucrats. Kai Lun presented his invention to Emperor He of Han, who was reportedly very impressed, which, in imperial China, meant you kept your job and maybe didn't get executed that year. The emperor loved it, scribes adored it, and the empire suddenly had a record-keeping solution that wasn't written on something you could stub your toe on. With paper, Chinese administration entered a new age. Suddenly, taxation, census-taking, legal records, and literary works didn't require pack animals or silk subsidies. Libraries grew, and Confucian scholars found themselves with better tools for copying the classics and probably passive-aggressively correcting each other's handwriting. But it wasn't just about state paperwork. Paper exploded as a medium for artistic expression. Calligraphy reached new heights. Painting became more portable, and poems floated from court to countryside with the elegance of cherry blossoms on the breeze. You could argue that without paper, China wouldn't have had its cultural golden age, or at least it would have had to carve its poetry into tree trunks. Now you might be wondering, if paper was so amazing, why didn't the rest of the world start using it right away? Because China didn't tell them. Seriously. The formula for paper making was treated like a state secret. For centuries, outsiders had no clue what the Chinese were using to make their infinitely scrollable texts. China became the sole supplier, exporting finished paper along the Silk Road, while carefully keeping the how-to behind bamboo curtains. While other civilizations were still scratching out orders on wax tablets or stretching animal hides for Bibles, China was printing Buddhist sutras like it was nothing. It was a trade monopoly so perfect, it would have made Jeff Bezos weep. The secret finally unraveled the way all great trade secrets do, through war, prisoners, and a little old-fashioned espionage. In 751 CE, during the Battle of Talas between Chinese Tang forces and the expanding Arab Abbasid Caliphate, Chinese soldiers were captured, among them papermakers. The Arabs did what any smart conquerors would do, asked politely, and then probably not so politely, extracted the technique. And just like that, the monopoly was over. Papermaking spread westward across the Islamic world, where it was further refined and embraced. Cities like Baghdad and Damascus became paper hubs, pumping out books, science, poetry, and philosophy that would eventually influence the European Renaissance. Thanks to this one war, the recipe went viral. But for those first 600 years, China held the pen and the paper. The rest of the world was just doodling in the margins. Kai Lun may not have known that he'd given humanity one of its most essential tools, just like he probably didn't know he'd one day be deified in some parts of China as the patron saint of paper. But his invention turned out to be the ultimate underdog material, low budget, high impact, and capable of fueling revolutions, religions, and romantic regrets in equal measure. So the next time you're scribbling a to-do list, printing out 30 pages you'll never read, or folding an origami crane that looks more like a napkin, remember, it all started with some old rags, a swampy tree, and one man's bright idea in a paper-thin empire. Because while the sword may be mighty, the pen and the paper under it made sure history remembered who won. The story of how paper made its way westward is a tale of espionage, accidental diplomacy, and the world's most constructive hostage situation. Picture this, it's 751 CE, and the Chinese Tang dynasty is having a tense little moment with the Abbasid Caliphate near the Talas River in Central Asia. Swords clashed, empires flexed, and amidst the chaos, the Abbasids captured something far more valuable than territory. They nabbed Chinese papermakers. That's right. The true prize of the Battle of Talas wasn't glory or gold. It was mulberry-soaked, pulp-beaten sheets of revolutionary technology. Before this unexpected handover, the Islamic world had relied on more cumbersome writing surfaces like papyrus or parchment, which, while functional, were about as cooperative as a soggy scroll or an ornery goat. But paper? Lightweight, foldable, copy-friendly, and if you spilled tea on it, at least you didn't have to explain the accidental disfigurement of a sacred calf. Once the Abbasids got their inky fingers on the paper-making secret, the real magic began. The first great paper-making hub sprouted in Samarkand, a city that didn't just sit on the Silk Road, it thrived on it like a merchant caffeinated on cardamom. Samarkand's paper mills used techniques imported from the East, but refined with local flair. Instead of the traditional bamboo and mulberry bark, craftsmen repurposed flax and linen rags, giving their paper a silky durability that suited scribes and scholars alike. No bamboo forests, no problem, just shred your old pants and call it innovation. From Samarkand, paper rode the wave of conquest and commerce into Baghdad, the glittering intellectual capital of the Islamic world. And once it hit Baghdad, the cultural floodgates opened. Caliph Harun al-Rashid, yes, the one from 1001 Nights, realized that with paper you could copy knowledge faster, preserve it better, and look more enlightened doing it. Suddenly, everyone wanted in on the act. Schools, mosques, and libraries began bulking up their archives. If ideas were gold, then paper was the bank vault. Baghdad didn't just adopt paper, it elevated it. This was the age of the House of Wisdom, a dazzling center of learning, where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, and then expanded upon them with brilliance of their own. Paper fueled a translation movement that would preserve Aristotle and Plato when Europe was still trying to figure out how to spell manuscript, algebra, medicine, astronomy, all these fields exploded in the Islamic Golden Age, thanks to a steady supply of papery potential. And here's where the Islamic world took paper and made it spiritual. Enter Islamic calligraphy, not just a writing style but an art form, a theological meditation and a cultural signature. Since figurative imagery was often frowned upon in religious contexts, the word itself became the canvas. Arabic script, with its sweeping curves and impossible elegance, found a perfect partner in the smooth, even grain of handmade paper. Imagine creating divine beauty with a feather and ink, and then remembering your cousin in Baghdad borrowed your favorite quill. Beyond the ink, the symbolism of paper grew. It became more than a tool, it became sacred. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a Kindle loaded with both science journals and scripture. Whether it was verses from the Quran or the musings of poets like Rumi and al-Mutanabi, paper preserved them all in a portable, reverent form. People wrapped books in silk, carried miniature Qurans in amulets, and passed down paper texts like family heirlooms. Literature wasn't just read, it was revered. Trade routes helped spread these ideas and the technology across the Islamic world, from Cairo to Cordoba. Paper crossed deserts on camelback, sailed across the Mediterranean, and snuck into Europe through Muslim Spain, where curious minds would soon begin asking, what is this marvelous material, and can we use it to start an era of slightly delayed renaissance? But that's another chapter. The Islamic world didn't just receive paper, it transformed it. It was the difference between having a recipe and becoming a master chef. Under Islamic stewardship, paper became the backbone of an intellectual movement that shaped science, law, medicine, and art. And it all started with a battle, a few captured artisans, and the brilliant idea that maybe writing shouldn't be done on cowhide or rocks anymore. For something so thin, paper had a tough time breaking into medieval Europe's good graces. Imagine introducing sliced bread to a civilization that swears by hard biscuits and stale loaves, and then trying to convince them that soft, flaky sheets made from old rags could replace their beloved animal skin manuscripts. That was paper's uphill battle in the West, from suspicious newcomer to print press powerhouse. Europeans in the early medieval period were deeply attached to parchment and vellum. After all, it came from livestock. What could be more European than turning a cow into both food and literature? Parchment was sturdy, creamy, and just tactile enough to remind you that you were holding something expensive. Paper, on the other hand, felt flimsy, foreign, and worst of all, it came from trash. You see, by the time paper tiptoed into Europe, around the 12th century, it was already common in the Islamic world. Spain, especially the region of Al-Andalus under Muslim control, became Europe's first accidental gateway drug to paper. But Europeans didn't just open their arms to it. They clutched their vellum tighter and squinted suspiciously. Paper was made from rags, and not even clean ones. This was a continent that bathed semi-annually and feared witches in windmills. You can imagine how well recycled cloth fibers went over at book club. Still, economic reality began to gnaw at their sense of literary purity. A single parchment Bible could require an entire herd of sheep. Monasteries were practically running petting zoos just to keep up with the demand for books. It didn't help that paper mills were popping up in places like Fabriano, Italy, and Chativa, Spain. Thanks to water-powered pulping technology and the tireless efforts of rag collectors who, yes, quite literally went door to door begging for old underwear. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Soon enough, rag-based paper proved not just cheaper, but surprisingly durable. Fabriano in particular became a paper-making hub, pioneering watermarking techniques and sizing methods to keep ink from bleeding everywhere. No one likes a smudged sonnet. As the costs dropped and production ramped up, scribes found themselves, perhaps begrudgingly, warming to the idea that maybe, just maybe, paper didn't have to be the literary equivalent of a knockoff handbag. And then Gutenberg happened. Johannes Gutenberg, a man with the patience of a saint and the budget of a medieval Kickstarter campaign, invented the movable type printing press in the mid-15th century. This wasn't the first time people had thought about stamping ink on surfaces. but Gutenberg did it with the kind of precision and scale that made monks nervous. Here's where things got steamy. Parchment was too thick and too pricey to run smoothly through a printing press. Paper, on the other hand, light, absorbent, pliable. Gutenberg needed something that wouldn't break the bank or the machine, and so began a passionate affair between paper and the printing press that would make a romance novel blush. The Gutenberg Bible, printed in the 1450s, used both paper and parchment editions, but the cheaper paper copies spread faster. Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Texts that were once lovingly copied by candlelight over the course of a monk's lifetime were now being spat out by the hundreds in a matter of weeks. Pamphlets, treatises, indulgences, political rants. Europe was now in the age of mass communication, whether it liked it or not, and not everyone did like it. The Catholic Church, which had a tidy monopoly on both knowledge and its delivery method, found itself facing a paper-fueled uprising of literacy. If anyone could read a Bible, or worse, write their own opinion on one, who would need a priest, or a Latin degree, or a bribe to get Aunt Gertrude out of purgatory. The printing revolution, fueled by humble rags turned paper, helped launch the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the modern idea of an informed public. And while Gutenberg's printing press was the tech star, it was paper that enabled its mass appeal. The monks did indeed weep, partly out of unemployment, partly out of frustration over paper's scratchy feel. By the late 15th century, Europe was teeming with print shops. Literacy was creeping into the middle classes, and paper mills were practically running out of rags. Fun fact, paper shortages were so common that rag thieves became a genuine problem, nothing like a black market for grandma's nightgown. In the end, Europe's initial paper panic gave way to an addiction it never really kicked. The very thing that was once mocked for being foreign and flimsy became the foundation of everything from Martin Luther's theses to Shakespeare's first drafts. It turns out that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are the ones you almost threw away with the laundry. Once upon a time, power came from the tip of a spear. Then it came from a stamp on a piece of paper. Somewhere along the road to global domination, the world's empires realized something profound. If you want to control people, don't just conquer their land, conquer their filing cabinets. Paper, that seemingly fragile invention, became the bedrock of empires, the tool of tyrants, and the quiet engine behind revolutions. Not bad for flattened pulp. Let's start with one of the oldest tricks in the imperial playbook, the decree. Paper allowed rulers to extend their voices far beyond palace walls. Roman emperors had inscribed stones and shouted heralds, but a printed edict on paper that could reach the provinces, the peasants, and the printers all in one sweep. It was law, it was permanent, and best of all, it was duplicable. If someone lost the original, no problem. The scribe had 5 more under his desk, still warm from the press. Then came the census, yes, the seemingly dull art of counting people, an art that paper turned into an obsession. Paper forms meant governments could track citizens, tally wealth and assign taxes with ruthless efficiency. You could dodge a sword, maybe even a royal decree, but good luck hiding from the taxman once your name was on parchment. Empires from Qing China to Napoleonic France built vast bureaucracies powered entirely by ink, quills, and a daily mountain of documents. And what did all this record-keeping breed? An army of bureaucrats. Civil servants multiplied like pigeons in a public square, each with a job title more convoluted than the last. You had clerks of tax rolls, registrars of vital statistics, and officials whose sole task was to stamp other people's paper. Bureaucracy didn't just use paper, it fed on it, flourished in it, and left future historians buried in it. If history feels long and overly detailed, thank the file clerks of empire, but paper didn't stop at boring forms. It got flashy, it got loud, it got political. Enter the newspaper, the 18th century version of Twitter, only longer and printed with more powdered wigs. Governments used newspapers to trumpet victories, bury scandals, and shape public opinion before it could shape them. Political cartoons mocked kings, columns criticized policies, and editorials launched entire movements. For the first time, the average citizen could wake up, sip coffee, and rage-read the news like a 1700s influencer with strong opinions and no Wi-Fi. Then came war. And in war, paper became both sword and shield. Ration books controlled who got flour, sugar, or boots. Propaganda posters rallied the masses with stirring slogans and heroic fonts. Identity papers, travel permits, conscription notices. Paper became the battlefield behind the battlefield. One forged pass could mean freedom. One missing document could mean prison. Empires that once measured strength in legions now measured it in paperwork. And let's not forget revolution. The American colonies didn't just throw tea, they threw pamphlets. Thomas Paine's Common Sense sold 500,000 copies in a population of 2 million. That's not just success, that's going viral in the age of muskets. Revolutionary France, too, ran on leaflets, petitions, and newspapers dripping with guillotine gossip. The printing press didn't just make ideas spread, it made them impossible to silence. Once printed, words could cross borders, spark riots, or start nations. A sword could kill a man, a pamphlet could kill a king. In the end, empires learned what Wilde would later put so stylishly: never underestimate the power of well-dressed words. Paper made empires smarter, scarier, and more efficient. It kept receipts, printed truths and lies, and turned power from something you held in your hand into something you could mail with a wax seal. The quill, it turns out, really was mightier than the sword, especially when attached to triplicate carbon forms. In the modern world, paper is so abundant that we often don't think twice before balling it up and tossing it into the recycling bin, or more shamefully, the trash. But once upon a time, a single sheet of paper was precious enough to be used, reused, and overwritten so many times it practically begged for retirement. In fact, before green living became a moral badge of honor, reusing paper was a survival tactic. In the medieval world, paper wasn't just a writing surface, it was an investment. Let's begin with a favorite trick of desperate scribes, the palimpsest. Sounds fancy, right? In practice, it meant scraping or washing the ink off a manuscript so you could write something else on top. That beautifully illuminated text about theology you slaved over last month. Sorry, the abbot wants a copy of Augustine now, so scrub it clean and start over. Parchment and early paper were too valuable to waste, so monks and scholars engaged in this delicate form of literary cannibalism. Future generations would be left with ghostly traces of lost works hiding beneath more contemporary writings, a frustratingly poetic metaphor for history eating itself. And this wasn't just about frugality. Some scribes reused paper or parchment for convenience, others out of necessity, and a few, brace yourself, because the previous text was no longer considered appropriate. Sometimes heretical texts were scrubbed to make room for more doctrinally safe writing. Imagine recycling a Harry Potter novel into a math textbook, but with holy implications and no chance of magic coming back. Fast forward to the early modern period, and the obsession with reusing paper didn't disappear, it simply scaled up. Governments, merchants, and the growing middle class had a growing appetite for documentation, contracts, inventories, receipts, wills, but the paper supply couldn't always keep up. By the 17th century, entire professions sprang up around rag collection because paper was still made from cotton and linen scraps. Households would save and sell old clothes to paper mills, knowing their tattered underpants might someday become a best-selling sermon. But it was the 20th century that gave us a full-blown paper panic. During World War II, paper rationing became a patriotic duty. Posters blared, "Save waste paper for victory," while children scoured alleyways and attics, gathering stacks for the war effort. Paper wasn't just for letters to soldiers. It was used for packaging munitions, insulating equipment, and wrapping medical supplies. Recycling became an act of national service, and suddenly Grandma's diary had a higher chance of ending up in a bomb casing than a library archive. Ironically, the post-war boom gave us too much of a good thing. By the 1950s and 60s, with industrial-scale paper production in full swing and wood pulp replacing linen and cotton, paper became cheap and ubiquitous. Want to prove how modern your office is? Buy a copy machine and drown your staff in memos. The dream of the paperless office would come decades later, along with the sobering realization that forests don't regrow as fast as printers can spit out spreadsheets. Which brings us to today. Modern paper may be mass-produced and relatively disposable, but its environmental cost has never been higher. Millions of acres of forest are cleared annually to meet the global demand for cardboard, books, packaging, and, let's be honest, junk mail. That receipt for a latte you didn't need, it came at the cost of a tree, and no one's reusing it as parchment for a sacred text anytime soon. Still, echoes of history remain. Archivists and historians now treasure old scraps of reused paper. Palimpsests are scanned with infrared to recover ancient texts, and wartime ration books are preserved in museums as cultural relics. What was once scraped clean in desperation is now examined with reverence. In a way, the journey of paper is a perfect mirror for human civilization, from sacred artifact to mass consumer item, from treasure to trash, and perhaps in the future, back to treasure again, if we learn to value it wisely.